Up to now, the conversation has been about machines, about AI, about whether artificial systems can become like us. We've said, no, they can't. They lack consciousness, moral agency, and love. They can simulate, but they cannot be. Today, I want to flip that question completely inside out, because there's a related question that is in many ways more urgent. That is, what happens when human beings begin to integrate more deeply with machines? Not in some sci-fi future right now, in labs, clinics across Europe and North America. What happens when technologies begin to intervene not in the external environment around us, but in the biological and neurological conditions of our own consciousness? That's the question of neurotechnology. And it forces us to revisit some of the deepest philosophical questions we can ask. What is consciousness? What is a person? What makes me the same person over time? What's the relationship between mind and brain? Can technologies alter not just what we do, but who we are? And if they can, under what conditions would that be good, justified, or dangerous? So, this video is about consciousness in relation to bio and neurotechnological developments, about how emerging technologies press on the boundaries of the human person, and about why responsible innovation matters even more when the innovation in question isn't simply a tool in the world, but a tool that enters in the body, interfaces with the nervous system, modifies memory, regulates mood, or mediates agency itself. Let me put the issue as starkly as I can. We've already argued that AI cannot simply become conscious by becoming more powerful. More data doesn't produce subjectivity. More compute doesn't produce interiority. More convincing outputs don't produce itself. That was the lesson of the last video. Now we have to ask the inverse question. If machines do not become persons merely by scaling computation, can human beings be reduced to systems by scaling intervention? And if we start to think of the human person as editable, optimizable, hackable, upgradable, then what kind of anthropology are we implicitly accepting? That's what I want us to think about today. So let's start with consciousness itself. In everyday language, conscious means something fairly simple. Someone is conscious rather than unconscious. Someone lost consciousness and regained it. We speak as if consciousness were a switch that can be flipped. Philosophically, consciousness is far more mysterious than that. It isn't just wakefulness. It isn't just responsiveness to stimuli. It isn't merely the ability to process information. Consciousness, in the deepest sense, refers to subjective experience. It refers to the fact that there is something it is like to be a conscious subject. Now, there is something it is like to taste coffee, no? To hear music, to feel shame, to remember childhood, to be anxious before an exam, to fall in love, to mourn, to hope, to pray, to regret, to imagine a future, to look at a sunset and feel wonder. That inner first-person dimension is what makes consciousness such a difficult object of analysis. A machine can register temperature. It does not feel warmth. A camera can detect light. It does not see in the lived sense. A language model can generate a beautiful sentence about grief. There is no grief there. No loss, no memory, no interior life. There is no one home. And this is why contemporary philosophy of mind distinguishes between what are called the easy problems and the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems aren't really that easy. They're just easier in principle. They concern attention and perception, memory, sensory integration, motor coordination, pattern recognition, the relationship between inputs and outputs. These are immensely difficult questions, but neuroscience and cognitive science can investigate them empirically. The hard problem is different. The hard problem asks why any of this processing should be accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why is there a felt quality, a what it is like dimension attached to neural activity? Why does pain hurt rather than merely function as an information signal? Why is red experienced as red? Why is there an inner point of view? Whether you accept every formulation of the hard problem isn't what matters here. What matters is that the problem points to a real distinction between functional description and first-person experience. You can describe what a system does from the outside. You can map its functions, its inputs, its outputs, its internal mechanisms. None of that gives you automatic access to the lived experience of being that system. In fact, that lived experience may not be captured at all by external description. And this is probably why so much of the public conversation about AI becomes confused. People see complex outputs and they infer interiority. They encounter linguistic fluency and infer understanding. They witness strategic action and infer agency. From a philosophical point of view, that inference is unwarranted. Simulation is not subjectivity. A system can behave as though it understands without understanding. It can produce coherent language without meaning anything. It can imitate empathy without feeling. And that distinction becomes even more important when we move to neurotechnology, because the same confusion can arise in another form. If consciousness seems closely associated with brain, then perhaps consciousness can be engineered, edited, enhanced, or replicated merely by intervening in neural processes. That conclusion does not follow automatically either. So let's slow down here and make the point very, very carefully. Okay? There is no question that the brain matters. Damage the brain and consciousness changes. Alter neurochemistry and mood changes. Stimulate particular regions and perception changes. Traumatic injury, neurodegeneration, pharmacology, anesthesia, electrical stimulation, sleep deprivation, depression, dementia, psychedelics, epilepsy. A whole range of conditions can affect the content, intensity, coherence, and continuity of conscious life. So no serious person denies that the brain is deeply involved in consciousness. The question is not whether the brain matters. The question is whether consciousness is reducible to the brain. And those are not the same thing. This leads us into one of the oldest and most contested debates in philosophy, the relationship between mind and body, or in modern times, mind and brain. One family of views says that the mind just is the brain, or at least that mental states are nothing more than physical states described at another level. This is broadly the physicalist view. According to strong versions of physicalism, consciousness is ultimately a biological process that can, in principle, be exhaustively explained in terms of neural mechanisms. On this view, if we know enough about brain states, we would know everything there is to know about the mind. That position has a certain appeal to it. It seems consistent with scientific naturalism. It promises explanatory unity. It tells us there's no mysterious remainder once the mechanisms are understood. But it faces profound difficulties. Even if we map every neural correlate of consciousness, we still haven't explained why those correlates are accompanied by subjective experience rather than mere function. We may know which brain states track sadness, that doesn't explain the felt reality of sadness. We may identify the neural signature of visual awareness that doesn't explain what seeing is like from the inside. Another family of views says that consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, even if it depends on them. Some versions of this are dualist, claiming that mind and matter are fundamentally distinct. Other versions are non-reductive or emergentist, arguing that consciousness emerges from sufficiently complex biological organization, but is not reducible to lower level parts. And still others emphasize embodiment and inaction, suggesting that consciousness is not located in the brain alone, but arises in the dynamic relationship between organism and world. The details differ. The central point remains: consciousness cannot be flattened into computation or mechanism without losing what is most essential about it. This is where our earlier discussion of Bernard Lonergan becomes very useful again. Lonergan does not treat consciousness as a vague glow or some mysterious substance hovering above the brain. He analyzes conscious life as a structured movement of intentionality. We experience, we inquire, we understand, we judge, we decide. Consciousness, on this view, isn't passive awareness. It is dynamic, self-involving, normatively structured. It is the activity of a subject moving through levels of attention, intelligence, reasonableness, and responsibility. This matters for at least two reasons. First, it reminds us that consciousness isn't just sensation. It includes understanding, judgment, and decision. To be conscious in the fullest human sense is not merely to be receptive, it is to be engaged in the pursuit of truth and the good. Second, it emphasizes that the human subject can appropriate these acts as its own. I can say, I saw that, I understood that, I judged that, I chose that. I can reflect on my own cognitional activity. I can discover that I was inattentive, that I reasoned badly, that I ignored evidence, that I acted irresponsibly. That reflective dimension is central to personhood. It underlies both moral responsibility and authenticity. Now, compare that with an artificial system. A model can process input and generate output. It can even monitor aspects of its own performance in a limited, functional sense, but there is no subject there who appropriates those acts as part of a lived, morally significant self. There is no I who understands, judges, regrets, resolves, or loves. There is a sequence of operations, not a center of conscious life. That is the gap between simulation and subjectivity. And this brings us back to one of the most famous thought experiments in philosophy of mind, John Searle's Chinese room. I gave the full version in the last video. The point Searle is making is not that computers are useless or that syntax doesn't matter. The point is that symbol manipulation alone is not sufficient for understanding. A person in a room can follow formal rules for rearranging Chinese symbols in ways that produce meaningful-looking responses to someone outside the room. That doesn't mean the person understands Chinese. The system produces appropriate outputs without semantic comprehension. Syntax, not semantics. Now, whether you accept Searle's argument in its strongest sense, it captures an insight that matters enormously for our topic today. Functional success is not identical with interior understanding. And the same warning applies when we move from AI to neurotechnology. A neural intervention may improve performance. It may stabilize mood. It may increase memory retention. It may accelerate response times. Those functional changes do not by themselves tell us what has happened to the subject as subject. They do not tell us whether authenticity has been strengthened or weakened, whether agency has been deepened or displaced, whether personhood has been respected or instrumentalized? That is the question to keep in front of us for the rest of this video. So let's turn directly to neurotechnology then. When I say neurotechnology, I mean technologies that interact with, monitor, modulate, or interface with the nervous system. That's a broad category. It includes brain-computer interfaces, deep brain stimulation, neuroprosthetics, neural implants, cognitive enhancement devices, brain monitoring systems, and increasingly, AI-mediated tools that interpret neural signals or behavioral proxies in ways that affect decision-making and treatment. Some of these technologies are clearly therapeutic. Cochlear implants can restore a degree of auditory function. Neuroprosthetic devices can help restore mobility or communication for people with severe impairments. Deep brain stimulation can reduce symptoms in some patients with Parkinson's disease. And in some contexts, treatment-resistant depression or obsessive-compulsive disorder. These are powerful examples of technology serving human flourishing. They don't erase the complexity of disability. They should never be discussed in a simplistic way. They undeniably show the positive potential of technological intervention in the nervous system. And from the standpoint of responsible innovation, this therapeutic promise matters. We are not anti-technology here. The point is not to romanticize suffering or to reject interventions simply because they are advanced. The point is to think carefully about what the intervention is doing, to whom, under what conditions, with what values embedded in its design, and with what consequences for responsibility, identity, and social life. The first major distinction we need to make, therefore, is between therapy and enhancement. Therapy aims broadly to restore lost function, alleviate suffering, or bring someone back toward a baseline of health or ordinary functioning. Enhancement aims to go beyond restoration toward augmentation or optimization. Therapy asks, how can we help this person regain or preserve capacities necessary for flourishing? Enhancement asks, how can we make this person smarter, faster, more focused, more resilient, more productive, or more efficient than what we take to be normal? The distinction isn't always perfectly clear. Many technologies do both. A stimuli can help someone with ADHD function better. It can also be used by someone else to push cognitive performance beyond ordinary levels. A memory support technology can compensate for impairment. It can also become an enhancement tool. A mood intervention can treat severe depression. It can also slide into emotional optimization for performance in work or military settings. So we should not think of therapy and enhancement as a strict binary. It's more like a spectrum. The distinction, though, remains philosophically important because therapy is usually grounded in a normative understanding of health. Enhancement quickly raises the question, better according to whom? And that question returns us to value-latedness. Every enhancement project presupposes a model of the good human being. It presupposes that more memory is better than less, that faster response time is better than slower, that emotional steadiness is better than emotional turbulence. The pain reduction is always preferable, that productivity is a meaningful metric, that resilience is superior to vulnerability, and so on. These assumptions are not value neutral. They reflect social, economic, political, and sometimes ideological commitments. Think about it carefully. Suppose we had a technology that could remove grief more quickly after bereavement. Would that be an enhancement? Well, from one point of view, perhaps yes. It reduces suffering. It helps functioning. It restores productivity. From another point of view, grief is not merely a malfunction. It is part of what love costs. It is one of the ways human beings bear witness to meaning, attachment, and the depth of relationship. If we treat every difficult emotion as a technical inefficiency to be optimized away, we risk hollowing out the very texture of moral and relational life. This is where today's lecture intersects very directly with the last two. In the last video, we argued that AI cannot love, because love is not calculation. It is not merely successful output. Love requires freedom, vulnerability, gift, reciprocity, and the willing of another's good for their own sake. Before that, we discussed what AI is. Neurotechnology now puts pressure on both of those claims. It asks whether we are willing to treat our own emotional and cognitive lives as technical substrates for optimization, and whether in doing so, we unintentionally adopt the very reductionism we criticized when applied to AI. Let me make this more concrete by turning to a few case types. Consider deep brain stimulation. In some patients, this technology can be life-changing. It can reduce debilitating symptoms and restore a degree of control. It has also generated significant philosophical discussion because some patients report not merely symptom change, but changes in personality, in affect, motivation, or the sense of self. Even when the results are beneficial, the intervention can raise questions like these. Do I still feel like myself? Are my choices really mine? Is this relief coming at the cost of authenticity? If my desires have shifted, are those now my desires? If a device is turned off and my personality changes, which state is the real me? These are not abstract questions. They go to the heart of personal identity. They show why neurotechnology cannot be evaluated only in terms of functional outcome. If we focus only on symptom reduction, we may miss what is happening at the level of personhood. Now, consider brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs. These systems are often presented as empowering technologies, and they can be. For a person who cannot speak or move, the ability to communicate through a BCI can be extraordinary. It can restore agency, relation, expression, and practical participation in the world. BCIs also complicate our understanding of action. If a device interprets neural signals, translates them through algorithms, and executes commands, where exactly is agency located? If the system predicts intention before full conscious articulation, how do we understand authorship? If the device adapts to me while I adapt to it, who is doing what? Again, the point is not that these technologies are bad. The point is that they are philosophically rich. They change the architecture of action. And because they do, they require a richer account of responsibility than simplistic narratives of empowerment or efficiency. Or think about memory technologies. Human memory is not a hard drive. It is selective, interpretive, embodied, emotional, and deeply connected to identity. Memory does not just store facts, it situates the self in time. It makes narrative continuity possible. It allows remorse and gratitude, reconciliation, trauma, healing, and hope. If we could one day edit memory more precisely, weaken it, strengthen it, or filter it, what exactly would we be changing? We might remove pain. We might also remove meaning, learning, accountability, or personal continuity. Suppose a technology could erase the emotional force of a shameful action from memory. That might alleviate suffering and might also interfere with conscious repentance and moral growth. Suppose another technology could produce perfect recall. That might look like an enhancement, but forgetting is not merely a defect. Human beings need forms of forgetting in order to live, to heal, to prioritize and to avoid becoming trapped in total recollection. Once again, the more is better logic of enhancement simply begins to break down. What all these examples have in common is that they expose the inadequacy of a purely functional anthropology. If the human being is just a performance system, then optimization makes sense as the highest goal. If the human being is a person with interior life, embodied vulnerability, moral development, and relational depth, then optimization can become a form of distortion. This is where transhumanism enters the conversation. Transhumanism is not just a collection of technologies, it is an ideology, or at least often functions as one. Its core intuition is that the human being, as currently constituted, is insufficient. We are too slow, too limited, too vulnerable, too mortal, too fragile, too dependent, too forgetful, too emotional, too embodied. The answer, according to this view, is not merely to heal or support human beings, but to transcend the human condition through technological enhancement. Now, not every person who supports enhancement is a transhumanist in the strong sense, and not every use of the word indicates the same position. As a broad outlook, transhumanism tends to treat biological limitation as a technical problem and personal identity as something modifiable through intervention. Mortality becomes a bug. Embodiment becomes a constraint. Dependence becomes inefficiency. Vulnerability becomes weakness. The goal is a more capable, more controlled, more optimized being. And at first glance, this can seem exciting. Who wouldn't want less disease, less suffering, better memory, more intelligence, greater resilience? The deeper philosophical question is not whether these capacities matter. Of course they do. The question is what kind of being we become when capability becomes the dominant measure of value. This is one of the most important lines connecting all of our lectures so far. We've argued that technology embodies values and shapes the moral possibilities of future users. We've argued that AI cannot cross the ontological line into personhood because it lacks consciousness, moral agency, and love. We've warned against the danger of anthropomorphic language and the tendency to confuse simulation with reality. Today, with neurotechnology and transhumanism, the danger is somewhat different, but just as serious. The danger isn't that we will mistakenly think machines as persons. The danger is that we may start thinking of persons as machines. And once that anthropological shift occurs, a great deal follows. If persons are machines, then they can be optimized like machines. If identity is just information patterning, then continuity is a technical rather than existential problem. If consciousness is just a process, then interiority can be treated as substrate. If moral struggle is inefficiency, then technologies that reduce friction will appear self-evidently good. If vulnerability is merely weakness, then dependence and grief, waiting, patience and care begin to lose their normative status. Here we need to be careful. Human vulnerability is not merely a defect, it is also one of the conditions of moral life. Because we are vulnerable, we need one another. Because we are finite, we must deliberate. Because we can be wounded, we can also be compassionate. Because we are embodied, our relationships are not interchangeable abstractions. Because we are mortal, our time has seriousness. Because memory is partial, forgiveness and narrative reconstruction matter. Because emotions can be painful, courage exists. Because desire is not fully programmable, responsibility is meaningful. None of this means suffering is good. It means that not every limitation can be treated as a mere engineering failure without remainder. Some limitations are woven into the texture of personhood and relation. If we erase them indiscriminately, we may not simply remove burdens, we may alter the conditions under which agency, love, solidarity, humility, or wisdom arise. This is precisely where Pope Leo XIV pushes the question in his 2026 encyclical Magnifica Humanitas. The encyclical, dedicated to AI and emerging technologies, makes the doctrine of limits as constituted of dignity and explicit anthropological foundation, finitude and vulnerability and illness and old age. The encyclical insists are not defects to be corrected, but the conditions through which humanity matures and opens itself to relationship. That single move stands in direct contrast to transhumanist anthropologies that treat human nature as something to be surpassed. Now, let's connect all of this directly to responsible innovation. Responsible innovation asks us to anticipate moral dilemmas, not merely at the moment of decision, but in the design history that creates them. The trolley problem, for instance, makes engineers ask how the system should have been designed differently so that the tragic choice need not arise. That is exactly the perspective we need here. The question is not only what a person should do once a neurotechnology exists, the deeper question is how these systems should be designed, governed, limited, and embedded institutionally so that they strengthen rather than weaken responsibility. Let me apply 5 core criteria: knowledge, intention, non-coercion, contributory fault, capacity. Knowledge. Do users understand what the technology does? What data it gathers? What risks it introduces? How it may affect cognition or identity? And who has access to the outputs? Informed consent in neurotechnology cannot be a legal formality. It must be meaningful, ongoing, and proportionate to the stakes. If a person does not really understand what an implant or neural interface does, then appeals to autonomy become shallow. Second is intention. What is the system for? Is it genuinely therapeutic? Is it being designed for care or for productivity, military advantage, social control, consumer dependence, or extractive business models? Intention matters not only at the level of the individual clinician or user, but at the level of organizational design, incentives, and institutional deployment. The third is non-coercion. Are people truly free to decline enhancement, or will educational, workplace, insurance, or social pressures make refusal increasingly costly? A technology can be formally optional and still function coercively once institutions make it a condition for success. This is especially important with cognitive enhancement. If some students, employees, or soldiers use enhancement systems, others may feel compelled to do the same simply to remain competitive. Fourth is contributory fault. When something goes wrong, can we trace the chain of action? Or has the design diffused accountability and responsibility beyond recognition? And fifth, capacity. Does the technology increase a person's real capacity for responsible action, or does it merely increase performance while diminishing self-understanding? This is a subtle but vital distinction. A system that helps a person communicate may deepen agency. A system that automates too much of deliberation may reduce it. What matters is not raw output, but whether the person is more or less able to act as an attentive, intelligent, reasonable, and responsible subject. Now bring in value-sensitive design, or VSD. VSD has a useful distinction between direct and indirect stakeholders. In neurotechnology, the direct stakeholders include patients, clinicians, engineers, caregivers, institutions, and companies. The indirect stakeholders are just as important too: families, employers, schools, insurers, communities, future users, social norms, even future generations who may inherit transformed expectations about cognition, emotion, and embodiment. A value-sensitive approach to neurotechnology would ask the same question that we ask of any technology. Which values are being supported and which are being undermined? Autonomy, dignity, privacy, identity, solidarity, justice, accessibility, accountability, trust. These are all relevant. Some of these values come into conflict. Efficiency may conflict with reflection. Control may conflict with spontaneity. Optimization may conflict with authenticity. Security may conflict with privacy. Enhancement may conflict with fairness for others. Because these trade-offs are real, the design of neurotechnology is never just technical. It is unavoidably ethical and political. Privacy, in particular, deserves special attention here. That we've discussed things like surveillance capitalism and the harvesting of behavioral data in the digital sphere. Neurotechnology raises the stakes dramatically because it approaches what some call mental privacy or cognitive liberty. Neural data isn't like ordinary data. It may reveal patterns of attention, affect, response, intention, or vulnerability that cut closer to the interior domain of the person. If such data is stored, sold, profiled, or used predictively, then the invasion isn't merely external, it begins to colonize what has historically been understood as the intimate space of selfhood. And this is why some philosophers and legal theorists have begun speaking in terms of neuro rights or cognitive rights. Whether or not one adopts that exact vocabulary, the concern is sound. If future technologies make it easier to infer, manipulate, or condition cognition itself, then traditional privacy protections may not be enough. We would need norms that explicitly protect mental integrity, freedom of thought, and the right to have one's cognitive life mined for economic or political purposes. Responsibility also becomes more complex in distributed systems. Imagine a harmful outcome occurs involving a neurotechnology. Was the user responsible? The clinician? The engineer? The company? The institution that normalized its use? The regulator that failed to intervene? Like with AI, we must resist the temptation to dump responsibility onto the artifact itself. Devices are not moral agents. They can reconfigure agency in ways that diffuse responsibility, and this is precisely why design histories matter. We must ask not only who acted last, but how prior design decisions structured the field of action in which the outcome became possible. Now, let's return briefly to the concept of authenticity because I think it's central here. Authenticity in the serious philosophical sense isn't merely self-expression or sincerity. It isn't just doing what feels natural. It is fidelity to the structure of genuine human knowing and choosing. It means being attentive to reality, intelligent in inquiry, reasonable in judgment, and responsible in action. It requires self-appropriation. It requires the capacity to own one's acts and to align one's life with truth and values. Now ask yourself, what kinds of neurotechnological systems would support authenticity and what kinds would undermine it? A communication interface that allows a person with paralysis to express their thought more fully may support authenticity. A device that stabilizes debilitating symptoms so a person can once again participate in family life, work, or moral decision-making may support authenticity. A family that bypasses too much of the subject's own deliberation, that conditions behavior through opaque nudging, or that optimizes emotional response according to external performance criteria may diminish authenticity, even if it increases efficiency. And that distinction is crucial. Not every technologically mediated improvement is an enhancement in the moral sense. Some improvements deepen personhood, others narrow it. This gives us a way to formulate a more adequate normative principle for neurotechnology. The question is not simply whether a device increases capability, the question is whether it increases the person's capacity to live as a person. That is, to understand, to judge, to choose, to relate, to love, to assume responsibility. That is a much richer standard than efficiency, convenience, or market value. So let me draw all these threads together. In the first video of this series, we insisted that technology is not neutral. It carries value, shapes possibilities, and affects future obligations. In the second, we argued that AI, however powerful, remains fundamentally distinct from the human person because it lacks consciousness, moral agency, and love. Today, we have taken the next step. We've asked what happens when technologies move inward. When they interface with the brain, when they regulate cognition, when they promise enhancement, and when they invite us to reconceive the human person in technical terms. The central philosophical lesson is this: consciousness is not exhausted by function, and personhood is not exhausted by performance. Human beings are not merely biological machines awaiting upgrade. We are embodied subjects with interiority, normative continuity, vulnerability, moral depth, and relational capacity. Our technology should be designed in ways that serve and protect that reality, not erode it. So, when evaluating bio and neurotechnological developments, we should ask at least 5 questions. The first: what conception of the human person is guiding the design? Is the person being treated as a subject or as a system, as an end or as an editable platform? The second: does the technology restore or support agency, or does it displace it? Does it help someone act more fully as a responsible subject, or does it make them more dependent on opaque systems of control? Third, what values are embedded in the intervention? Whose account of the good life is being operationalized? Whose interests are being served? Fourth, what happens to identity, authenticity, and relational life under conditions of use? Even if the technology works functionally, what does it do existentially? And fifth, what kinds of institutions, incentives, and safeguards are needed so that these technologies do not become instruments of coercion, surveillance, or dehumanization? These are not secondary questions, they are the central questions. The future of neurotechnology will not be decided only in laboratories. It will also be decided in philosophical anthropology, in law, in ethics, in public institutions, in design cultures, and in the moral imaginations of the societies that build and adopt these systems. If we do not clearly clarify what a person is, we will have no adequate way of deciding what should or should not be done to persons in the name of progress. And this is where the deepest continuity across all of our lectures lie. Responsible innovation is not just about preventing harm after the fact. It is about shaping design in light of what human beings are. If we get the anthropology wrong, we will get the ethics wrong. If we mistake capability for wisdom, simulation for consciousness, control for agency, or optimization for flourishing, we will build technologies that are impressive but impoverishing. So then, let me leave you with a final thought. The real challenge of neurotechnology is not whether we can intervene in the brain. Clearly, we can. obviously. Increasingly, we will. The real challenge is whether we can do so without forgetting that the person is more than the sum of neural processes, more than data, more than behavior, more than function, more than output. If AI tempted us to overestimate machines, bio and neurotechnology tempts us to underestimate ourselves. They tempt us to think that if we can modulate, optimize some aspect of human life, then we have explained it. Explanation is not possession. Function is not meaning. Intervention is not wisdom. The task, obviously, is not to reject technology nor to worship it. The task is to govern it in light of serious understanding, in understanding of consciousness, of responsibility, of the human person. That is what philosophy contributes. It slows us down. It asks us what kind of beings we are before we decide what kind of tools we should build. In an age increasingly captivated by enhancement, prediction, and control, that slowing down may itself be a moral necessity. In the next video, we'll change gears completely. We'll look under the hood of the most powerful AI systems in the world right now, large language models, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, what they actually are, how they actually work, and why understanding the pipeline matters for every ethical claim we make about them. Until then.